last panel of the day, and this panel is, of course, devoted to bringing things back to the Lone Star State. What are the things that are currently making headlines in ERCOT? And there are a lot of things. So some recent coal plants announced to be retired, Vistra purchasing Dynegy, persistently low gas and wholesale prices that don't quite show signs of slowing yet. Or are they? So what I'd like to focus the panel on today is what does this mean for the reserve margin in ERCOT? What does this mean for power prices in ERCOT? And what do those power prices mean for renewables development in ERCOT? And we have a distinguished panel of engineers that are going to steer us in that conversation. First, we have Tony Maselli, who's the VP of Strategy for Vistra. We have Cheryl Mele, who's the COO of ERCOT. Prior to being COO of ERCOT, she was the COO of Austin Energy. And we have Greg Thurnher, who is heading up real-time trading for Shell. Prior to Shell, he also chaired the DREAM Task Force, which some of you will be aware, advised ERCOT on kind of the market framework around DERs in the state. So let's start. Oh, and I should introduce myself this time. My name is Claire McGee, and I'm a principal with the kind of the joint consulting group that's shared between MAKE and GTM and Wood Mackenzie. So, without further ado, we'll start with a reserve margin question, which is, how accurate do you think the reserve margin in ERCOT is? And I ask this because a lot of people, maybe take for granted the numbers that are published, but based on how you think about how wind capacity is counted into that figure, some people have differing opinions there. So eager to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, I guess I'm going first.
You can.
I thought that was for you.
I can start if you want. I can speak to the fact that the CDR, of course, is where we often publish that reserve margin, and so that's a very prescriptive program that ERCOT puts out twice a year, and we just follow kind of what's in the guide and the protocol of what that reserve margin is. Now I think that the other two gentlemen might want to jump in on how accurate is it.
Yeah, and markets wouldn't be fun if ERCOT got the reserve margin, perfectly correct. In fact, I'm of the opinion that ERCOT's job is to, as Cheryl described it, perform the CDR calculation in a transparent and timely manner with the best inputs available. And on the supply side, from a load perspective, ERCOT's quite good at anticipating load year over year. It's much more speculative on, excuse me, I think I said that backwards. ERCOT's very adept at creating load forecasts, and those are very prescriptive, very much an integral part of the CDR, but on the supply side, rather, it's a little bit more speculative what goes into the CDR from a market entrance and market exit perspective, and I'll let some of my other panelists speak to retirement, since I think that's part of the reason he's in the hot seat.
Sure,
but
he's in the hot seat.
The reason that this is speculative is because developers of any type of project, be it renewable or traditional fossil fuels, need to portray to their stakeholders that it is in fact a viable project. And in the 17 years I've been in the industry, there are still some viable projects in certain interconnection queues that will likely not make any more electricity than the sand that they're intended to be built on. So knowing that we all act in our best interest to convey accurate and timely information, this is competitive information. It's much more difficult, particularly in markets like ERCOT's energy-only market, to anticipate what supply is coming. And as I'll say later in my commentary, most development projects are just one hedge away from being built. And it's incumbent upon the marketplace to determine whether or not their handicap on the CDR aligns with ERCOT's expectations, such that we have segments of buyers and sellers and have a vibrant marketplace with differing opinions of the accuracy of the CDR. So my only request, which Cheryl's always delivered on, is that it's on time, It's got the best information available, and it's inclusive of all known additions and retirements. And it's been rather exciting recently. We've had a big wave of retirements. Did you want to speak to that?
Oh, I guess I will. So, I mean, looking at the market, we obviously think CDR is correct in the aspect of what's in it. We can't second guess that. I think what we do is that we bring an aspect of the financial attributes of each plant, which are not necessarily in ERCOT's view, and in creating a retirement situation or creating a position where we have a corporate point of view, which is then related to ERCOT at some point in time. But I think in total, we believe that there is a sufficient reserve margin out there that while retirements are something that we had to announce, they're not the be-all, end-all, and I don't think the world is cratering based around, call it a 1,500 megawatt or more, give or take, load reduction due to a retirement.
So one of the questions I have is not just if what's in the connection queue will be built, but at what level of capacity does it actually show up on the system? So I think, for example, ERCOT is expecting that wind capacity, it's about 18.7% of installed wind capacity shows up at peak. But then we've seen months where wind generation contributes as little as 8.7% of its capacity factor at peak. So is that something that you look at carefully, when you're placing your bets in the market?
So let me try and answer that a little bit. So Luminant is probably the largest PPA purchaser of wind energy. I think that's correct. We obviously have to look at that as we balance the portfolio from a perspective of, I'll call it the wholesale generation and the retail side. So it very much comes into play. I'm not in the trading operation. I'll leave that to others. But if I was, that would be one of the things that keeps me up at night, using a phrase from before, saying, is the wind going to blow tomorrow? So it's something that we have to look at quite considerably.
And that's how ERCOT looks at it, right? We are looking at, as that wind does come in, and that's been part of the question mark that Greg so eloquently pointed out, is that, we've got things in that queue. We know that probably not all of them will get built, but as they are built, what, ERCOT is kept up at night is making sure that our forecasting is good. And so that's really our part of the job, is once it's on the ground, can we do a good job accurately forecasting, or as accurate as we can, both what the load expectation is and what the wind expectation is.
And so assuming, that there will be, Greg, you had mentioned earlier when we were conversing at lunch that you've already seen prices jump in response to retirements. Is that across all zones?
Yeah, the most recent wave of retirements moved forward, so significantly moved the needle. They've oscillated a little bit as the markets internalize the news, and I think that was a very natural market response in terms of whether or not it was in all zones. It's certainly pronounced in the zones in which the retirements were announced, which also happens to be one of the more liquid zones in ERCOT. So, but a retirement event in the gigawatts is significant system-wide. Some zones more than others, and the congestion dynamic with removing a tremendous amount of generation from a particular zone can have implications for other regions. But it depends on what time horizon, right? Because we have some faith that ERCOT will remove impediments from a transmission perspective to make every megawatt deliverable to a certain extent from an economic perspective.
And how evenly, so speaking of, kind of benefits being maybe distributed not evenly across ERCOT when something like this happens, from the technology perspective, when you see the reserve margin crunched like it is, you see power prices respond differently across different zones. What might that mean for different technology types? Like, should we expect to see generation resources benefit with enjoy some relative degree of equivalence from the bump in power prices? Is there some time sensitivity to this?
Well, from a development standpoint, if the wave of retirement introduces real scarcity or fear of scarcity, of course, that increases the demand or appetite for hedging, and that is beneficial to all technology types, regardless of fuel source or lack thereof, because of the implied option value of having price certainty around a long-term hedge. Now, I'm also of the opinion that as we have an increasing proportion of renewables within the ERCOT system, which is seemingly expected to continue for the foreseeable future, that we're going to see more erratic prices when we have pronounced wind ramps or solar ramps or some combination of wind ramps, solar ramps, and load ramps. So the net effect of the three when introducing volatility would not only reward everyone who decides to engage in hedging, but more specifically reward those who are fast and flexible resources that can respond to intermittency and complement and perform some of the balancing functions that is needed with a large percentage of renewables.
Yeah, it's certainly something that we are asked to look at frequently at WoodMac. So you'll have a developer or an entity that's looking to invest, and they say, take a look at this portfolio. And we have our own expectation of when this power is likely to deliver and what the price is going to be. And can you spot check this? And I think that's something that maybe that isn't quite pronounced today, but that WoodMac is forecasting might be impactful down the road. There might be a more significant disparity is the discount that wind sees to market averages. So right now in the West Zone, where of course it's going to be more pronounced, it might only be $1 off market averages on peak. But you go forward 10 years, and granted these numbers have not been adjusted for the recently announced retirements, but that wind is seeing a much more dramatic, like I said, disparity between when those wind farms are producing and the pricing that they're seeing relative to the zonal averages to the tune of $3, $4, $5. So, but interestingly enough, and I don't know if we're right or not on this. It's for a lot of people in this room, perhaps to determine, but we don't see, for example, solar going in volumes that would be sufficiently significant to produce a discount to solar at the time of peak. We always see solar enjoying a premium to market averages. So I'm just curious, like if you are looking at these, or if you're weighing these things when you're making decisions about assets that you're investing in, where they're and the locational sensitivity to some of those price differentials.
So let me take a shot at that. So Vistra is building a 180 megawatt solar facility out in the West Zone. It'll be one of the very few market-based solar facilities. Matter of fact, I think it might be the second, but definitely the largest. We definitely have to look at things like congestion, transmission flow, and things of that nature. So when it comes into kind of placing a market-based bet, and you're building what we're building out there, you absolutely know that we're looking at all those premiums versus any sort of detriment.
And in your experience, because of course, historically, Vistra has centered on ERCOT as an owner of Luminant and TXU, but the family has gotten a lot bigger with Dynegy in the mix now. So how do you approach development and procurement in some of the other big ISOs, given where prices are there, just for comparison's sake?
So my prior job was with Con Edison Development, so we were coast to coast doing renewables. I can say that the Dynegy situation is shaking out. The documents are only signed, but it'll be months and months before closing. So I don't have that crystal ball. But I think you have to approach it from a coast-to-coast aspect and dealing with each of the different ISOs that we will be in. So each of those will change the way that we invest in what traditionally was the Luminant portfolio, which will now be the Vistra portfolio coast to coast, knowing that we're in 5 active markets now. So it's going to change quite dramatically.
So bringing this back to Texas, we see prices, maybe they don't respond, maybe they do. What does that mean for renewable PPAs in Texas, to take this in a different direction? Because, and I don't know the extent to which you have exposure to some of the PPA prices, like routine exposure to some of the PPA prices we're seeing come in Texas, but because of the persistently low prices, we tend to see there's just not this appetite to hedge. In my experience at a retailer, Greg, to what extent do you encounter this?
Well, we still do see a certain demand for renewable PPAs where large block loads tend to want to bring their own power, and there's a number of components that drive that demand. Some of it's social responsibility. There's a lot of economics behind it, and the policies and practices for integrating assets into ERCOT is very well favored among when compared to some other entities. Now, in terms of the future for those PPAs, once you sign one, my particular group's happy to manage it, but we continue to hear downward pressure on price. And to your point, we haven't seen that move demand, but nonetheless, I do get the feeling, and this is Greg speaking, not necessarily Shell Energy, that loads have been lulled into a lower for longer price environment where the wise choice is to wait and buy later, both from a PPA perspective and a shorter term hedging perspective. There hasn't been significant scarcity pricing in the recent past, at least 6 years, where there's been sufficient volatility to really drive a strong appetite for hedges. Now, is there still a liquid market? Absolutely, and that varies year to year depending on your term and volume. But nonetheless, I'm very hopeful that after all of the market reform that we've endured to try and attract resources to continue to maintain resource adequacy in ERCOT, that this summer, weather removed, will be a good dress rehearsal for scarcity with our significant change in asset base.
And when you say scarcity pricing, I just want to make sure we're clear on that definition. Do you just mean wholesale prices that are above the marginal cost of a generator, or do you mean unique Texas instruments like the ORDC?
That's a good question, and it's been a long time since we've seen sustained pricing above the marginal cost of most technologies. And as you know, this particular model that we operate within in ERCOT's energy-only market is very much a must-be-present-to-win lottery. And I use that term loosely because I'm only trying to express that the vast majority of resource revenues are captured during the very, very few highest-priced hours in a year. So we're talking about maybe a dozen hours making up for the vast majority of a resource's costs and hopefully some reasonable rate of return. And when I speak to scarcity pricing, I'm suggesting that on a system-wide basis, it's a little bit different on a nodal basis, we haven't seen scarcity prices consistent with capacity shortage system-wide since the summer of 2011. And those types of years, albeit very infrequently, not only sustain existing generation, but also incent new builds to come online to satisfy new demand on a speculative basis or fulfill an overwhelming appetite for PPAs or some sort of hedge to protect themselves from short-term scarcity, which again has been rather infrequent. So,
what do you make of, so a couple of years ago, I guess I should start the question this way. A couple of years ago, we saw a really interesting future ancillary services proposal come out of ERCOT. And that it didn't get very far. But now we're seeing pieces of it reappear. And Cheryl, can you elaborate on where the most interest seems to be in finding more interesting ways of rewarding resources that can respond quickly and can perform for the amount of time that you need them to?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that you're right. The FAST project on whole did not get anywhere, and we kind of moved on from that. And we have seen some pieces of that come back. But really, as the grid operator, what we want are the right set of kind of agnostic to technology, but still focused on what are the characteristics that different technologies do bring to the table, and how much of those do we need. And so in the aftermath of FAST, we have continued to support the stakeholder discussions and really, doing work where we're asked to really look at, can we change this? Can we change that? Some of those have been kind of well received, and some of them have had ends to themselves. Some of them have gone the way of FAST, right?
Yeah.
So I think we'll continue on that. Sorry, I'm not really staying over my mic, am I? I just realized that. It's kind of way over there. So I think we will continue to look at that. And certainly what we do on an annual basis is really look at the existing set of ancillary service and make sure that on an annual basis we look at the grid and we bring forward recommendations on exactly what quantities of which one we are expecting to need over the coming year. And that process is underway now. We're beginning to kind of bring that out there. But as ERCOT itself, we haven't really promoted or said we need something to change, but we are certainly open and working with stakeholders to make sure that the grid is being as flexible as it needs to be to respond to those renewable resources and the characteristics they bring.
And so if you had to, if you owned, imagine for a moment, if you owned a generation asset in ERCOT, where does the money, like when you are looking at, let's take, I guess it would be easier to take an example. So you've got a CCGT facility, it's in the North Load Zone. Are the economics, how much of the economics are to be reaped from spot versus long-term hedges versus having a firm off-taker in the form of a TXU versus an ancillary service? Like, where is the most interest in that kind of suite of potential revenue sources for a generating asset?
So if I could pick where I was going to put all my power, it would right now be in the Houston zone, which we all know. So, but that's not quite so easy to do, and I do it, every time that it turns red on the map, so to speak. But I think that the West, we have to be concerned about the congestion that's coming, not what's here, but with the amount of plants that are up there. The North Zone has its own set of some congested areas, but being near the load pockets is really where we want to be. So, obviously that's the simple, easy answer, but if I can service close by and, God forbid, something changed at ERCOT, that would really be where we would want to be, and that would be where the most value is.
So it's just all about proximity to load and less about...
the offset in value in what load you're in can be easily worked on, and that's exactly what our traders and people do. It's not as big a difference to us as you would think because of where we generate around the state. And
so for you, you said Houston load zone would be where, if you had your druthers, where you would, in an ideal world, be able to locate all of your assets. Not the West Zone because of the congestion issues. Is there...
You went to CCGTs versus renewables, so you have to go one place or the other.
If we're talking renewables...
Well, then I want to be in the West or the North.
Congestion, ceteris paribus?
Aside, because the irradiance is so much better, and even with your curtailment, you're still going to do better in the West.
Can we ignore, so the question for you, can we ignore the congestion? Is there, and I'll ask this like from a hypothetical view, do you see stakeholders in ERCOT optimistic that there will be some alleviation of that congestion in the, let's say, near to midterm being somewhere south of 10 years?
So I'm going to answer your question in a little bit different way. We don't see an immediate problem, so 0 to 5 years. There's an interim period that I would call 5 to 8 years out where things become where we need a change, and then there's the period after that, which is we don't know what changes are coming, at least we don't. So, you know, in the short term for renewables, I wouldn't be concerned to it at all based on the next, let's call it 5 years. Some things have to change, let's call it 7 years out, that people should be concerned about that, but I think it'll self-correct. The grid, you know, the interconnects, the transmission lines, they'll be built by 10 years out. That's our hope.
So my last question, and I think this is another good one for you, and perhaps Greg, given his perhaps Greg, given his growing experience with the retail relationship with MP2 Energy. But what are then, until those congestion issues are remedied, are there opportunities for distributed assets in ERCOT that really tap into the value of transmission and distribution cost avoidance? Kind of a curveball.
There's certainly some value in distributed generation. I don't know that's particularly congestion related because I think historically the ERCOT transmission planning process has been very adept at addressing perennially congested buses. And distributed generation also, you know, if we're talking behind the meter generation, gets the benefit of a blended load zone rate when they inject to the grid. So that particular opportunity isn't there, but I'd like to pull at that thread a little bit in a different direction. You know, when you were asking us, or druthers, of where we would have resources, when and why, as I mentioned earlier, in this very binary priced market where prices are extraordinarily high for a short period of time, we're at marginal cost of a combined cycle for seemingly the rest of the year. Fast and flexible resources that can go from offline to fulfill a system shortage in short time periods, and we're talking sub 10 minutes, in some instances sub 5 minutes, is tremendously valuable, particularly if that capability exists to cycle and respond to the same event the next day, the next hour, whenever it may occur.
So does load fall into that category then for you?
It most certainly can, and like ERCOT, we're technology agnostic. If you can fix the problem, it doesn't matter if it's load, battery, gen, whatever fuel may be powering the technology you utilize to address a market need that's signaled by price. We're all for it, and in fact, I'd say that we largely prefer that to a transmission solution where the timeline is more expedient, and perhaps that's what you were teasing out. Mm-hmm. You know, some of these distributed generators can appear quite quickly when compared to the interconnection process for a wholesale resource. It's still well controlled by the transmission and distribution utilities, but nonetheless, to the extent that they can take advantage of some transient pricing, haven't seen a whole lot of that because there's still some pretty significant metering and installation costs, regardless of whether you're in front of or behind a load and meter. But those opportunities do exist when you can share the value with the customer for enhanced reliability, demand charge management, and other benefits of having a behind-the-meter asset.
If I could add to that real quick, the large commercial users really are much more sophisticated today than they used to be, and in that, going to Greg's point, I mean, you can't discount that they're much more sophisticated. They get the market dynamics now. The whole idea of putting rooftop solar or any other thing out there, we could get into a whole dissertation and discussion about that, but you got to remember they're that sophisticated now that they know what they're getting into short-term pricing because of how transparent we are.
Oh, and of course, and there's so much DR that's outside of the formal ERCOT rubric of emergency response service and load as a resource that will show up just to mitigate that 4CP risk. So I think we are out of time, and I think there is a cocktail reception that most of us are eager to get to. So let's give our, our panelists a round of applause. Thank you all so much.